Thank you, Speaker. Colleagues, I also rise today to speak on the government's motion for confirmation of a declaration of emergency. Let me begin, colleagues, by saying this. The Conservative Party of Canada stands for law and order. We always have and we always will. I am very happy, as I am sure you all are, that the blockades were lifted rather peacefully and without extensive damage to property. I salute the great work of our police forces and the restraint shown by the large majority of protesters. We can all be relieved that it is over. That being said, we are now being asked to vote on a government motion. I agree with most of the legal and constitutional experts, most of the provinces, and most of the observers in Canada and in the rest of the world. This government, the Trudeau government, failed to make its case for the use of the Emergencies Act. Furthermore, the measures it adopted are not reasonable, not proportionate, and not necessary. And finally, even if the declaration of emergency was warranted and the measures satisfied the criteria I just mentioned, the emergency no longer exists. This is why, together with other reasons, I will explain why I will be voting against Senator Gould's motion. But before I delve into why I do not believe we should be supporting this motion, I would like to take a step back and review what brought us to this place. COVID-19, Senators, has been very difficult on everyone. The virus has exacted a terrible toll on our health and well-being. The pain and grief experienced by so many cannot be overstated. In response to the virus, those in possession of authority across the country enacted public health measures to try and prevent avoidable loss of life. And while I believe these measures were taken in good faith, there still is much debate over whether these were proportionate, advisable, and effective. There is no debate, however, over the fact that they too exacted a huge toll on Canadians. Not only did our loved ones die, they often died alone. Families were separated for a month and in some situations for more than a year. Grandparents from their grandchildren, adult children from their parents, siblings from one another, and on and on and on. We all have our personal stories, and I have mine. I stood for almost a year and waved to my mother in the second floor of her nursing home. Now I am able to see her. Looking forward to seeing her again this weekend. Colleagues, we couldn't see our friends. We couldn't go out to eat. We couldn't go to our favorite sporting events. High school graduations were lost. I know that many of them were still conducted virtually. But to those students, they never had the graduation they had dreamed of for 12 years. Marriages were postponed, and when they did take place, only a handful of people could be present to celebrate. Funerals, those final goodbyes, were restricted to immediate family only, and even then, the numbers were often limited. Businesses were closed, provinces were locked down. Income was lost. For those in the lower half of the wage spectrum, debt piled up. And now inflation is eating away at the spending power of what we have left. When vaccines became available, Canadians lined up and rolled up their sleeves by the millions. To date, over 80 million jabs have been administered across the country, resulting in more than 30 million people being double vaccinated. This is fantastic, colleagues. With more than 90% of its adult population at least double vaccinated, Canada has one of the highest rates in the world. But even at 90%, that means that 10% are still not vaccinated. Choosing not to be vaccinated is rarely a choice for those who remain unvaccinated. That's because for them, this decision is often driven by deeply held beliefs. I'll be the first to admit that some of those beliefs fall squarely in the camp of conspiracy theorists, but not nearly always. Sometimes it is religious beliefs. Sometimes it is a lack of trust in those in positions of authority. Sometimes it is medical reasons. Sometimes it comes from knowing others have experienced a serious adverse event after vaccination. The list goes on and on. But regardless of what you think of the reasons, they are always based on deeply held convictions. Trampling over those convictions and belief is not wise. Colleagues, I am fully vaccinated with 3 doses, and I encourage everyone else to do the same. But mandating people to be vaccinated and penalizing them for not doing so is something that I find extremely offensive. And it concerns me that as a nation, we have embraced this level of coercion so easily. The idea that we can cajole, coerce, and even intimidate people to get vaccinated is not only wrong, it is dangerous. It promotes the fantasy that Canada is a homogeneous society. This is absurd. It never has been. We need to come to grips with the fact that in the 21st century, with the internet and the prevalence of social media, we are never going to have a unified, homogeneous approach to many things in Canada. This means that we must strive to protect people's rights to freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, freedom of association, freedom of belief, and I would add, freedom of vaccination status. If we do not do that, then our only option is to resort to greater and greater degree of totalitarianism, where we increasingly force people to comply with things that we do not agree with. This, colleagues, would not only be a tragic mistake, it would tear our country apart. And yet, this is precisely what the Prime Minister thinks we should do. He believes everyone should be vaccinated, and those who are not should be scorned, shamed, and punished for it. Justin Trudeau has been frustrated since the 2019 election. The fact that he only got a minority and finished behind what he considers are unworthy Conservative opponents in the popular vote made him first depressed and then angry. And then COVID happened. He spent hundreds of billions of dollars. He told Canadians he had their backs at least 1,000 times, thinking that he deserved to be rewarded for spending other people's money, our money. He cynically called a useless election during the pandemic. After the first 2 weeks of the campaign, alarm bells started to ring in the Liberal war room. Canadians were being ungrateful to their leader, and they risked losing to those hated Conservatives. So they went to the old Liberal playbook, wedge the CPC, find a scapegoat somewhere, and run against that group. They tried abortion for the nth time, but that did not work. Then they found the group to run against, the unvaccinated. The policies adopted by this government went from science-based with a view to reducing transmission to the virus to veiled or not so veiled attempts to punish the people who were not vaccinated. They decided to divide Canadians simply to score political points. They crossed a line at some point from looking for limited, effective, and reasonable measures to targeting a small group of people in order to shift the polls. Canadians were fed up with the pandemic and the restrictions, and people who were not vaccinated became the focus of the anger. The Trudeau government was happy to oblige. If you look to history, it is always the case. People will try to find a scapegoat. Foreigners, religious minorities. Then with COVID-19, it became the unvaccinated. Liberal MP Joel Lightbound pointed this out a few weeks ago when he openly criticized the Prime Minister's approach when he said, "Both the tone and the policies of my government changed drastically on the eve and during the last election campaign. A decision was made to wedge, to divide, and to stigmatize. I fear that this politicalization of the pandemic risks undermining the public's trust in our public health institution." He is absolutely correct, colleagues. Shame on the Trudeau government for using the approximately 2 million Canadian adults who chose not to be vaccinated as a political football instead of trying to convince them to get the vaccine. Justin Trudeau decided to insult them as if that would help get the vaccination rate up. Some of us may not agree with them or their demands, but that is no reason to vilify fellow citizens. It needs to be pointed out, however, that in spite of all these public health measures and vaccination requirements, the pot did not boil over until the federal government decided to mandate vaccinations for truckers who haul loads across the United States border, and then threatened to do the same for truckers who cross provincial borders. Although the government was unable to provide any scientific basis for this decision, they refused to move from it. It is ironic that these truckers were now the government's target. They were the same people whom the Prime Minister praised in the early days of the pandemic when he tweeted, "While many of us are working from home, there are others who aren't able to do that, like the truck drivers who are working day and night to make sure our shelves are stocked. So when you can, please thank a trucker for everything they're doing and help them however you can." That, colleagues, was March 31st, 2020, less than 2 years ago. Colleagues, the crass political manipulation of this should alarm us all. Truckers are hardworking men and women who only drew the line after 2 years when the government decided that all the measures already taken were not enough. And now they were going to mandate measures for which there is no clear scientific basis. Truckers who spend their days alone in the cab of their vehicle suddenly became a threat to public health if they were unvaccinated. Yet, when challenged to provide scientific evidence for this decision, which would destroy more livelihoods, the government had none. Colleagues, these are the men and women who left their homes to drive to Ottawa, not for an insurrection, but for a demonstration, for a protest against government overreach that has been becoming endemic. At first, it was just a few truckers who hit the road and hoped to raise a few $1,000s to cover some of their expenses. But it wasn't long until the convoy's length was measured in miles and donations in the millions. At every community, more people joined the convoy, and at every town they drove through, people cheered them on. Every bridge they drove under was filled with people waving Canadian flags and thanking them. At intersections in cities, and even long after they had left the cities behind, people were parked on the side of the road to cheer them on and thank them. After 2 years of pain, hope was beginning to stir again. The truckers were uniting our country. The thing you need to understand is that the Ottawa Freedom Convoy 2022 was truly organic in its development. It has been noted over and over by the media that there was no one leader and there was no one singular agenda. As happens with grassroots movements, people attach themselves to the movement for a variety of reasons. And yes, it is obvious that some very bad elements joined this process. That was enough for the Prime Minister and his caucus members to decree that the truckers and the millions of Canadians cheering them on were terrible people. The Prime Minister's characterization of them as racist, misogynist, insurrectionists, and a fringe minority was shameful. He portrayed them as dangerous, potentially violent, and possibly terrorists. They all had intolerable views. How can we tolerate these people, he asked. This is incredible. The Prime Minister of Canada goes on television and asks the questions about millions of his fellow citizens. How can we tolerate these people?